getting to the end of my high school days, and I started developing acid reflux. And at that stage, I didn't really know much about reflux. And you take Eno and it relieves the symptoms, but it started becoming chronic. It started becoming chronic to the extent that the Eno wasn't even helping. Go to the doctor tells us, look, see this condition in a lot of people getting acid reflux symptoms, and they administer PPIs, so omeprazole. PPIs actually reverse your normal digestive process. So our stomachs produce acid in order to help to digest the foods. You take a PPI, it stops the stomach from producing these acids. But it's this recognition that our gut is like an ecosystem. There's different bacteria, microbes that survive within your gut. Now, when we end up taking PPIs, creating an environment where there isn't these stomach acids that essentially help to keep a lot of these bad bacteria out of our stomach. Creating a situation where bad bacteria and toxicity can proliferate within your gut. You often see people developing other conditions. So acid reflux may be the basis. There's no recognition of where this food is coming from. How did it get to the store? There's a total disconnect between what we're consuming. When it comes to a lot of the packaged products and the processed, even plant-based foods, the way in which foods are being labeled, almost deceptive in a way that it communicates to us what it inherently is.
Greetings, seekers of ancient wisdom. Today I'm joined from an expert, a self-studied expert in the gut, Jayshal Daya. Jayshal, you're joining us all the way from Canada. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good, and it's a honor and it's a privilege. I think some of it is a bit of an exaggeration in terms of expert, but I'm deeply humbled by what you mentioned.
Yeah, so Jayshal is quite humble, but the reason I call him an expert is he spent more than a decade, or I would say even a couple of decades, studying the gut. Well, not studying it, but experiencing the gut. So, Jayshal, I'm really interested to understand how you got to understand your gut and how it's such an important part of your body. Maybe tell us a little bit of the journey that you went on.
Yeah, sure. I think that was very much instrumental in me learning a lot about health. If I take you back to the time when I started, and a lot of this is what I share on my channel as well, and it's at the time when I started this journey, I had no interest in health. I never cared about health that much. I grew up in a traditional Indian home. Whatever your parents give you to eat is food that you consume. I never really even had an interest to get into studying biology at school or anything of that sort. But where this journey really got started for me is when I was getting to the end of my high school days, and I started developing acid reflux. And at that stage, I didn't really know much about reflux. I told my parents I'm getting reflux. They tell you, well, go and take gaviscon or go and take something to Eno. Those days it was Eno, and you take Eno and it relieves the symptoms. But it started becoming chronic. It started becoming chronic to the extent that the Eno wasn't even helping. That means after every meal that I was consuming, I was getting acid reflux symptoms. And I was consuming foods, traditional Indian foods, so at first I thought it's a spicy food. Let me carve out the spicy foods, carved out the spicy foods, the acid reflux is still there. And I end up in a situation where my parents look at me and say, well, you've got to do something. We've got to do something about this. You can't be, taking after every single meal. We go to the doctor. Doctor tells us, look, see this condition in a lot of people getting acid reflux symptoms, and they administer PPIs, so omeprazole. And I trust the doctor at this stage. I'm like, I've got a problem. You fix me. You solve the problem. You the expert as a doctor, and that was my relationship to it. And I'd been on this PPIs, and I used to consume. I take the PPIs and consume the meals, the general everyday meals that we consume. So think about the conventional Indian foods, the processed foods, all those things. Consuming all these processed foods with the PPIs, it generally takes most of the acid reflux symptoms away. And going down that rabbit hole of trying to solve the problem with PPIs, doing it for a number of years, eventually I start to think, well, I've got to do a bit more research. I've got to understand my condition. I can't keep taking this. I try and get off the PPIs, and every time I try and get off the PPIs, acid reflux just keeps coming back. Eventually, I realized, you know what, this is not really working for me. But I tried so many different things. I started delving down so many different rabbit holes to try and understand. I tried at the initial stages. I came across things like cabbage juice. Take cabbage juice in the morning, and cabbage juice should solve your problem. But not really understanding it. There's all these like little pieces coming to me. Try cabbage juice, but doesn't do anything to solve. So it's to try something out, give up. Try something out, give up. And over a prolonged period of time of taking PPIs, eventually I start developing other sorts of deficiencies. And I think that's the part where I need to probably explain what PPIs do. PPIs actually reverse your normal digestive process. So our stomachs produce acid in order to help to digest the foods. You take a PPI, it stops the stomach from producing these acids. As a result, the food isn't digested. So when I used to go to the toilet and do number 2, as everyone refers to it, I used to see food still staying in their solid state. And that got me wondering, like, what's going on with the digestive system here? I'm trusting the doctor to solve the problem, but it's not really doing anything. And this is a very condensed version of my whole journey. Like you mentioned, it's been over a decade going through this. Doing all the research and then finally stumbling, and I stepped onto this thing that, wait a second, it's got to do a lot with diet, the foods that I'm eating. If I need to do it, I need to do this in a very structured way, in terms of thinking about what am I consuming, what is giving rise to it. Because like I said, I started developing all these deficiencies, vitamin deficiencies, started feeling weak, and I was like, go back to the doctor, they tell you the same thing. Risk versus benefits. You're going to take the risks of taking these PPIs long term, but then you can survive, and you probably need to take it on until you die, because you can't get off these drugs. And the side effects on the long term is not just these deficiencies. You often end up with osteoporosis, and my mom has this condition, and that's a very, very aggressive condition to have. And I was like, this doesn't make sense. This does not make sense at all. Like, why should we be taking medication that's leaving us worse off? And when I went down this rabbit hole, starting to understand this whole thing, notion of these drugs not really solving the problem, just masking the symptoms, I started to look at the alternative space. What are they recommending? Starting to play around with diet, carve things like gluten, dairy, carve those things out of the diet. And once I started doing this, I started to notice I was able to drop the dosages of the PPIs, but it still wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. But I reached a stage of frustration at that time. I was like, what the hell with it? I've got to get off these PPIs. I started eating plant foods. I didn't know as much as what I had learned up until now. So my approach was it wasn't that robust approach that I know now in terms of helping a person get off PPIs. I went cold turkey. I was still consuming bland steamed foods, but I was consuming proteins. Proteins and fats tend to be very hard on the digestive system. And because I was consuming proteins and fats, I was still getting acid reflux. It might not have been as bad because I carved out the gluten and a lot of the processed foods. But slowly going through this, and I made my mind that I just want to get off these PPIs. I started to work on diet quite a lot. Eventually reaching a stage where I started to do a lot of detoxes and I started to understand more and more about food and its effect on our gut, its effect on our digestive system. What are we as humans truly meant to be consuming? What are those foods? And try and understand how I'm able to sustain, because there's a lot of misconception today around protein, and you've got to be consuming so many grams of protein in order to sustain yourself. I had gone on a diet that was very minimal from its protein content, and I started to feel better. I was like, there's a lot of misinformation today out there in terms of what we're supposed to be consuming for our health and what is really beneficial for our health. And slowly over time, I started to understand more and more about food, doing detoxes, juice fasts, trying to understand this connection between the food that we're consuming and our gut health. How do I end up feeling? Trying to, at one stage, I was journaling almost like religiously, journaling in terms of the reactions that each food was giving me. If I consume this, I get an acid reflux reaction. How soon is it? And starting to better understand the food and the gut connection as well.
My goodness, that was quite a journey there, and I really love how you took the onus, on yourself to do the research, because what the doctor was giving you, yes, it was alleviating the symptoms, but it wasn't solving the problem, and you took that onto your own shoulders and figured it out by experimenting, maybe unbeknownst to you, like you didn't really have a plan, but you experimented and journaled and tried this and tried that, and eventually found less protein worked for you. And I think people must resonate with this, if anything, is like really listen to your body and try different methods until you find one that can work for you in the long term, right? I mean, without masking the symptoms. So this is the question I want to ask, because this is where you really piqued my interest, right? This PPI that you mentioned, PPI, I don't know what it stands for, but we're going to put it up on the screen. You said it's called omega Prexel, I think, or something like that.
Yeah, so PPIs are proton pump inhibitors,
Wow. Okay. Proton pump inhibitors.
and they essentially stop the stomach from secreting acid. They reverse the entire normal digestive process.
Yeah, so this is amazing. So the solution to acid reflux is, let's reduce the acid. And what's one way to reduce the acid? Let's switch off the pump that produces acid. So it makes perfect sense how this can alleviate the issue, right? I mean, you have acid reflux, you take this PPI, you don't have any more acid reflux because there's no more acid in your stomach. So it sounds like a great solution. I mean, maybe one of the downfalls you said was, your food is not digesting properly, but it does take away the acid reflux. So I can see why so many people would continue taking this, because you are sorting out the symptoms, right? So I don't understand what the real issue is if, okay, fair enough, you're not digesting your food properly. But I mean, is there anything more serious than that by turning off your acid pump?
That's a great question. And I followed the same thinking. When I started off on these PPIs, I thought, well, it's solving my problem. It's solving the acid reflux symptoms. Yeah, there are times when I need to increase the dosage in order to alleviate the symptoms. But it's this recognition that our gut is like an ecosystem. There's different bacteria, microbes that survive within your gut. And in a normal person's digestive system, these bacteria that are meant to be there survive in that acidic type environment. Now when we end up taking PPIs, it's essentially it's reversing this whole process. It's creating an environment where there isn't these stomach acids that essentially help to keep a lot of these bad bacteria out of our stomach. So we're creating an unnatural situation, creating a situation where bad bacteria can and toxicity can proliferate within your gut. And when this happens, we think, oh, everything is normal. It changes our craving for certain foods because these bacteria start to crave certain foods. The gut is not really able to digest. There's no stomach acid to break down the foods. These bad bacteria, they end up consuming a lot of the foods that we're eating. So we'll oftentimes start to crave. I used to crave a lot of sweet things, a lot of processed foods, even while being on these PPIs. And we create an environment where these bad bacteria start to flourish. And because of that, we start to develop these absorption problems. But it's a very slow process. So we don't recognize the bad effects initially at the onset of taking PPIs. It's over a prolonged period of time we start to develop these deficiencies. And it's because it's changing this entire dynamic of the way in which your stomach and your gut's supposed to operate.
So what are the deficiencies besides craving sweet things? Like, doesn't sound like so bad if that's the only deficiency. Or are there more deficiencies that you have for prolonged use of these?
Yeah, so that's also a great question. So when it comes to the gut, we consume certain foods because of its nutrients. So vitamins, minerals, trace minerals, all those things. The stomach acid helps to break down those foods and allow for the intestines and that to start to absorb it and get it into your bloodstream. When we end up in a situation where we're taking PPIs, there's no stomach acid, so there isn't much of that stomach acid to actually break down any of those foods and get the mineral content and nutrients from the foods into our system, into our bloodstream, so that we can operate optimally. So when I was on PPIs, I was taking a lot of these multivitamins to be able to just sustain energy levels. So we need to take it in all these supplement forms, sublingual forms, to try and avoid having to go through the stomach's digestive process. And yeah, you can be on that. You can be on that for a period of time, but eventually things start getting so bad, the toxicity starts accumulating to such a bad extent that even that levels is not enough. So you keep on having to increase. And because of this, it starts to cause more and more other deficiencies and other chronic conditions that start to proliferate in your body. And that's where you end up with, you often see people developing other conditions. So acid reflux may be the basis. Because you're treating it with PPIs, you end up developing other chronic conditions over a prolonged period of time.
So let's delve into the acid reflux elements. And I'm sorry, I'm like so curious about this because I don't have any experience studying or researching this. I had different gut issues, and we can talk about that a bit later in the show. So I had a different journey through my gut issues, that helped me to learn what to eat better for myself. But what is acid reflux? I mean, I get it, like, okay, acid is going back up the esophagus, the acid in your stomach, but what what actually happens? Is it something in the foods that causes the acid to, like, I don't know, bubble up or like become like a fountain and start spraying up from the stomach back up the esophagus? Like, do you know a bit more about that you can share with us in the audience?
Yeah, sure. And so when it comes to acid reflux, not all are the same. There's different variations of acid reflux. There are people who have too much stomach acid, and that ends up also causing acid reflux. There are people who have too little acid reflux, but basically it's a dysfunctional gut, a gut that's not functioning the way it should. Some people complain about, a sphincter, which is what separates your esophagus from your stomach, becoming loose and allowing, not closing. So when a normal person consumes food, it'll allow the food in, but then it closes, and that stops the acid from getting gushing back up into your esophagus. But what happens with a lot of us is our digestive system becomes so bad. Okay, whatever digestive process is supposed to take place in the gut, becomes so bad that there isn't that right blend of acids, and that's what led me, it was like a huge wake up call for me. Is not just getting more acid, because when I first went to a naturopath, they told me take hydrochloric acid tablets, try and boost up the acid within your system. Take apple cider vinegar, and that's going to help you to boost your digestion so that you can break down the foods. And this was post PPI. So going down that path, trying to increase the acid levels wasn't really making much of a difference. And as I started to read up and research more, because I tried this, and a lot of what I learned is through trial and error. It's not like I'm some expert in terms of knowing all this. It's through experience. And so I experienced all these adverse side effects of trying all these different things, the HCl, trying uh, the apple cider vinegar as well. But what I started to learn, and what was so important, is that our stomachs don't just produce one strain of acid. There's a multitude of different strains of acids that are produced by the stomach in order to digest foods. And when we consume the wrong types of foods and we increase the toxicity in our stomachs, and it ends up becoming a situation where it's not functioning at its optimal level. When we start to develop those deficiencies in those different strains of stomach acids, it starts to create that environment where things are not digesting properly. There's poor digestion, these pathogens and bacteria, bad bacteria start to proliferate. Your digestive system becomes weak. And then, because the digestion is so weak, even if you have that low acid levels, the sphincter and that doesn't close. Acid just comes gushing back into your esophagus. So there's that element, and then like I said, with acid reflux, it's not just a one stream. There's a variation of different types of acid reflux, but generally it's all linked to the digestion. The digestion being so poor and not functioning in the way it should be functioning, that often gives rise to these acid reflux symptoms.
Okay, interesting. So and now you like giving me so much more questions because this is a field that I don't know much about. So you mentioned all these different acids, right? So the stomach produces a multitude of different acids, and it's probably different acids that are to break down different types of proteins or different foods, etc. And I guess there's so much intelligence down there in our gut. We're so oblivious to. We're just carrying on with all we can comprehend and process with our conscious mind, but our unconscious mind is doing so much. And in our gut, our unconscious mind is also doing so much with just breaking down and digesting this food, right? The food that we're eating is getting broken down in our stomachs and then getting absorbed through our stomach lining into the blood vessels, and then going through the blood vessels to the liver, and then the liver is like further categorizing and breaking down these foods, and like all these amino acids are then recalibrated to proteins, and I don't know, there's hormones and there's so many other functions, and like it's just mind-boggling that so much is going on right here in our bodies and we're so oblivious to it, and it's like so amazing. So let's delve into this acid part of our stomach, and and I also want to go into the intestine. I don't know if when you speak about stomach, you're referring to the whole gut system, which is obviously the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and small intestine is a real big component, right? Because it's a couple of meters of small intestine piping right here in our abdomen, and then we still have the large intestine before it goes right out of our system. So I'm really fascinated about the acid levels and alkalinity levels and bacteria throughout that whole system. And the fact that you mentioned there's so many different acids, maybe you can talk us through that if you of what you know.
Yeah, so from my understanding is there's often this misconception around hydrochloric acid. So when I refer to different types of acids, I'm referring to different strains of hydrochloric acid. And unfortunately, when it comes to the current system, or even if you look at the alternative system, a lot of them are not aware that our stomach is this phenomenal chemical factory in terms of producing these different types of strains of acids. They're not the same as these external variations. Maybe one day when we get there and they start to recognize, and we'll start to have much more sustainable options being provided through a multi-strain approach. But because there isn't that recognition that there's a variation of those different strains of hydrochloric acid that needs to be supplied by the stomach in order to facilitate the digestion, by just taking one strain, we create that imbalance in our stomach. And when we have that imbalance, it disrupts the whole digestive process, because like you mentioned, there's an intelligence within us that knows way more than we know, and it's allowing for that intelligence to do those jobs that it's supposed to do. And by supplying the right minerals, the nutrients, trace minerals, and foods that we consume, we allow for that process to take place, from that right variation of stomach acids and different things that the body's supposed to be doing to take place. Now, when we disrupt that, we end up creating havoc in the stomach or the gut. We often talk about the stomach because that's where the stomach acids and that are secreted before it goes into the further digestive process, where it goes to the smaller intestine. And then you get into, a lot of people start to talk about leaky gut, and leaky gut where your villi is so damaged or eroded or burned or scorched by all the gluten and all those things that we've been consuming, that you aren't able to assimilate a lot of what you consume. So I often talk about the stomach because that's where the acid reflux starts, or at least that's where my understanding of where this whole disruption or the acid starts gushing back into your esophagus. But it causes all that havoc further downstream as well, because that's when you start getting into the leaky gut, which is where the absorption takes place. So the stomach does, starts the digestive process and then enters into your intestines, where the acidity environment of the intestines, or at least my understanding, is that it's not as acidic as what the stomach is. It's been through that processing or the digestive process that the stomach goes through, and then once it enters into the intestines, that's where a lot of the assimilation starts to take place, the vitamin and mineral assimilation. But because we start consuming all these foods like gluten and dairy, and even the processed foods like the hydrogenated oils, all those start to create havoc on the intestines, and they start to, it's almost like it forms as toxicity. So if you look at a lot of what the leaky gut videos cover, and they provide this image of leaky gut where you have a lot of toxicity buildup on the intestinal line, so nothing really can seep through into the blood system, or you often have more and more toxicity ending up seeping through, and that toxifies your blood, and it doesn't allow for the nutrients or the villi to actually do its job of filtering out all the toxicity and only allowing what should pass through that gut lining.
You've just given me a light bulb moment, Jayshal. Like I was just about to explain how my journey was through my gut, right? And you have explained like your acid reflux issues and how you figured that out to find a diet that worked for you, that treated the acid reflux at the cause. My issue is exactly on the other side of your stomach, and I had leaky gut. So my diet and my gut health was like always poor, because the biggest things that I would consume was cow's milk or dairy, lactose, and I've subsequently found out that I'm lactose intolerant. And I used to consume huge amounts of gluten. And I've also subsequently found out that I'm gluten intolerant. Gluten is very bad for my system. And I suffered from leaky gut throughout my childhood. and early teens and early 20s. And I had no idea what it was. Like I was just always constipated, and like my going to the stools was always challenging and irregular. And I remember the one tipping point for me, like the one turning point was, I think I was in my late 20s, maybe like 28 or 27 or so. And I always had constipation, throughout my late teens and 20s. But constipation would be a couple of days, 2 days, 3 days, and eventually I would go to the bathroom. But at this age of 27 or 28, I ended up having constipation for 9 days. 9 days. Like this was crazy for me. And I was like, I was like not able to go to the bathroom. I just didn't know what to do. I took the laxatives. I did everything they suggested, ate fruits and bananas and drank lots of water, and I just could not go to the bathroom. I even gave myself an enema, right? I went to, you can go to the chemist and you can actually buy an enema machine. And like nothing worked. It was so frustrating for me. I never had the chronic experience that you did, where I went to the doctor and did chronic medication, etc. Like I, for some reason, I just never really went to the doctor that often. I don't know what it was about me. I just didn't do it. So anyway, I had this bout of 9 days of constipation, like 9 days, and this for me was like, okay, I need to do something about this. I can't carry on suffering with this. I need to fix this issue I'm having. And anyway, I came across this book about eating for your blood type. It was quite popular at the time, I think 2000, late 2000, 2008 or so. There was this book about eating the right food for your blood type. And, I found my blood type, and the author was talking about cutting out lactose and gluten. And immediately cut that out, or immediately after cutting out lactose and gluten, I immediately noticed that my stools were becoming more regular. Like I would actually go daily, and I stopped having this constipation. And that was for me like where everything changed in how I saw my relationship with food. Because prior to that, my diet would be a morning cereal of Pronutro, which is a very popular gluten-rich cereal in South Africa. And I have Pronutro with like full cream Parmalat or clover milk. And that was my breakfast. That's how I'd start the day. Then lunch, I would have bread sandwich with something like bread and protein or chicken or beef or whatever. And then dinner would be pizza or I don't know, like chicken and chips. And that was pretty much my diet, day in, day out. And it was quite difficult to like cut out this Pronutro thing. I've been eating it for like 15 years or something. This has been my staple diet. And I'm one of those guys who can really eat the same breakfast every day. Like if I find something that tastes good, I can eat it every day. Like I've got no issues, because for me it's like I take the thinking out of it. I found something I like. It tastes good. It's healthy, or at least that's what I thought it was for me at the time. And I can just eat it daily, and I don't have to worry about it. And I'd buy it in bulk. When there's a sale at Checkers, I'll end up buying like 4 or 5 big packets of Pronutro because I know I'm going to eat it. But wow, this was such a game changer for the way I looked at food when I cut out gluten and dairy, which was such a huge part of my diet. I was eating them like every single meal, like huge amounts of milk and gluten, and cutting that out and seeing that it completely changed how regular I was going to the bathroom. That was my beginning of my journey with my gut, and then I went through a whole journey to get to where I am now with my diet. So yeah, man, it's just so amazing that your story was like on that side of the stomach, and then my story was on this side of the stomach, but we sort of ended up in a similar type of diet. So that's going to be my next question. So what is the diet that you've come to now? Because you've gone through trial and error and so many different things, and You said you tried the supplements and tried that and low protein. I don't know. So maybe tell us a bit of what it is that you went through, and then your final diet, that you're on now, that you tried to be on. I mean, obviously we all fail here and there, but that you strive to be on.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks so much for sharing that. And so many sort of triggers are going off in my mind because when you described what you were consuming, it was the exact same things I was consuming. I grew up on cereals. Cereals used to be my go-to, and ProNutro was the thing. I used to always gravitate to ProNutro, and there was a maize version too. The maize version of protein, and then later they came with the whole wheat version. But I used to consume a lot of these foods, a lot of cereals, ProNutro, to Wheat Bix, all of that. Cereals used to be my favorite food, and milk. I used to love milk. I even mentioned, I know in one of my previous episodes, where I used to treat acid reflux by taking a glass of milk. And yes, it alleviates the symptoms, but it brings it later on with a vengeance. So you get such a bad reaction afterwards. And the problem with milk is it builds up a lot of mucus. But something that triggered almost like a light bulb in my mind when it came to going down this rabbit hole of trying to understand, gluten and dairy. Why is it a concern? Because when we look at diet and we consider what is a diet our grandparents were consuming, what is a diet? I mean, milk and gluten were around for eons, right? If you look at even in some of the texts, they describe, bread being eaten, in India is like rotis being eaten. They're all gluten based. So why is it that there weren't the prevalence of chronic conditions way back then? And a lot of it comes down to understanding like gluten has become, or bread has become so ubiquitous in society. So many people consume bread. It's like their daily meal, whether coming from the Western Hemisphere, Eastern Hemisphere, wherever you are, it becomes a integral part of our diet is gluten consumption. Think of breads, naans, rotis, all of them have gluten in it. But in the West, it's really bad. It's really bad because of the way in which it's processed. And I think the same thing in South Africa as well, is the way in which gluten is processed. So they carve out all the nutrient component of it, and it's just isolated to the bleach part of gluten. So we end up with where all the beneficial aspects of gluten, the way in which it was processed in the past or prepared in the past, where they used to ferment the gluten as a whole and grind it and go through a natural process. Now you end up with a version of gluten where it strips out all the hull and all the fiber content, and you just get this white flour, and then sometimes it goes through bleaching, and we end up with an isolated version of gluten that's in a lot of the food products that we consume. So when we end up consuming these type of foods, it doesn't digest well because it's not a whole food anymore. It's a processed version of the whole food. And the same thing goes for dairy. When we think about dairy and the antibiotics and the foods that these cows are being fed, some of them are not even consuming grass. They're not even free roaming in the fields. They're being injected with antibiotics. The casein content of the dairy is totally different. So a lot of what we see now these days is you have stores now selling A2 milk because A2 has now become this thing of, if you consume A2, it's the version that better assimilates within our digestive system. But they're still pumping these cows with a lot of the antibiotics. And when we consume this, there's also this notion when it comes to cow's milk that there was a certain time when in the States they started to ban the consumption of raw milk. And when milk goes through the pasteurization process, a lot of the enzymes and all the whole food components of it are being destroyed. So the vitamins, all that through the heating process, it starts to get destroyed. The vitamins, the enzymes. So now when we consume these pasteurized milk, it ends up causing havoc in a system and causing this mucus production because it's not really that same food that it should be. And then there's also this notion when it comes to dairy consumption that if you look out in nature, a lot of the young, like the calves, and even you look at all the animals that consume milk from their mothers, it's only consumed for that initial period when they're in their infancy. Once they've surpassed that, they no longer consume milk. Why are we as humans still consuming milk past that period? It's like you feed on breast milk for that 2 years or a year. Some people, it varies between different people, but it's only during that infancy stage. After that, you let go of milk consumption. Yet it's become this industrialized thing and become almost a norm where we're still being told that you should be consuming milk on an ongoing basis. So if you look at the nature and the natural process, we're not supposed to be consuming milk. Yet we still end up consuming it, and it's causing a lot of havoc because of all the processing as well. But to get back to your question about diet and how my diet, so it's all these different aspects that started to come into my awareness and how I started to transition, because I started off with the same thing. I used to love Indian food. I loved all those curries and that, and I used to love eating roti as well. So I used to consume a lot of gluten, pizzas, all those things. I used to love eating those foods. And gluten was also a major component of my diet, and milk as well, because I mentioned consuming a lot of cereals, and a lot of cereals are consumed with milk. So I used to end up having a lot of these types of foods, processed foods, cakes, and all that. And initially, when I started off on this diet, trying to understand diet, I thought, well, you just have to carve out sugar. And I'd look at the packaging and look for the sugar content. Look at what's the sugar content, what's the fat content, and then say, okay, well, it looks kind of healthy. It's within a reasonable range, and then that's how I decide what's healthy and what's not healthy. Not going beyond that, not going beyond the ingredients. These days, you can't even understand half of the ingredients that are on a lot of the processed and packaged products, which is a totally different rabbit hole that we can go down. But when we start to understand diet, and then I went through this process and trying to better understand what are those foods that I'm consuming, what is conducive to health and what is not conducive to health. And I started to understand about gluten and dairy, carve those out of the diet, but still ending up having acid reflux reactions. So I started to carve more out of my diet. Like I said, I went through this journey of journaling all the foods that I was eating, journaling the different types of foods and trying to understand where's the connection with the acid reflux. And as I started going through this, I started to identify more and more foods. And this started bringing up so many different revelations for me, because I went down this path of understanding processed oils. So a lot of the foods that we consume, they cooked in oils. And oils are very tricky. They're fats. And as I mentioned earlier, fats are hard to digest. But these hydrogenated oils are these ultra processed oils. So they're not even the regular oils. They're not these virgin cold pressed oils. They are like toxicity on the next level. A lot of it isn't even is GMO, and it's not even organic. So when we consume oils, it will be a concentrated form of the pesticides and everything, because it all that leaches into the oils. So consuming foods that have all these hydrogenated and processed oils in them, it causes absolute havoc on our digestive system. So when I was consuming deep fried foods, and I used to love those chips that used to be fried in deep fried oil, and my parents used to own a business where they sell chips and things that were deep fried. And when you look at it, and that's when I started reflecting on it and trying to understand, why are these foods causing so much of problems? And I started to look into it, the oil scenario, and why is the oil causing so much of havoc on our digestive system. And yes, it's a lot of it is these processed oils. But if you think about any business, even if you take McDonald's or whatever fast food place you go to, they are frying chips in oil. That oil is being constantly heated. It is not economically feasible for them to change the oil each time a new customer comes in and cook the chips in totally new oil. That oil is constantly being reheated until it gets to a point where you need to then change. So maybe after a certain cycle, then only you would change the oil. So we're consuming that. When we consume all these foods, these processed foods, it's the same thing. The concern now is that a lot of what we're consuming when we think about these packaged products is we have absolutely no visibility of what is taking place before these foods actually get to that stage where it's being packaged. What is that processing that the food is going through? What types of oils are being used? Is that oil being constantly being reheated and then ending up in the food that we're consuming? And because we have that disconnect, we don't recognize what toxicity we're really putting in our digestive system. What are we really consuming? But it's going through all this sort of understanding and these revelations about food, trying to understand food. And that's why you have this movement today that is saying, let's go back to eating whole foods, the way Mother Nature served these foods. And as I started to go closer and closer towards whole foods, that started catalyzing a lot of the healing. Because once you step back into nature and you start stepping back into whole foods in their authentic form, then we start to heal from a lot of the conditions. And we start to recognize how heating in itself is dentering a lot of the protein content or the protein molecules within these foods. So as close to raw as we can stick. Now, I'm no way saying I'm a raw vegan. I still find it challenging. There are times when I'll go through a phase where I'll go completely raw, and I'll recognize during those stages when I go on a completely raw vegan diet, I have generally almost no acid reflux symptoms. Now, I'm not saying there aren't other factors. There are obviously times when if you're extremely stressed or you have all those other factors that come into play, might still give rise to an acid reflux symptoms. But going on a raw vegan whole food diet, that was the main diet that make a fundamental difference in the healing of acid reflux, and I think potentially even a whole host of other conditions as well, because you're going back to Mother Nature, you're going back to the way in which food's supposed to be consumed. So ultimately, that journey of understanding foods led me towards recognizing what diet is really conducive to our health. And it doesn't mean, like, when people talk about, sometimes people take raw vegan too far. And my understanding of raw vegan is if it's steamed foods, it's still okay, as long as it has the moisture content. You don't want to be consuming foods that are dehydrating. So a lot of the processed foods, how do we feel afterwards? We get acid reflux symptoms too, because they devoid of all of the natural moisture content. We're heating foods to such an extent where we evaporating a lot of the moisture. We're drying it out completely, and then when we consume it, we feel dehydrated. And then after that, we need to go and have water or drink some liquids to try and push the foods down to allow for a better digestive process. And because of that, we end up having also a lot of like other complications, because when we consume foods that are dehydrating, it's not just dehydrating itself, it's dehydrating to our cells as well. And that is the need for us to change our approach to diet, change our approach to what foods we're consuming, so that we're consuming foods that are nurturing our body, that are being enriching our body with the nutrients and that it needs, that it's easier on the digestive process, because the raw foods generally have a lot of the enzymes intact. When we heat foods and we cook foods, it tends to destroy a lot of those enzymes and nutrients in those foods. And that sort of really catalyzed a shift in my understanding to better understanding how diet interacts with our health.
Wow. So I had also quite a similar finding to my diet. So my diet at the moment, and it's taken me many years and many iterations and many different trials to get to the diet that I eat now. And I'm like quite happy with it. It's not perfect. I'm sure there is gluten and stuff that seeps in there here and there, but I think it's a much healthier version of gluten that I've found that works for me. So morning I have rolled oats, so it's like nice rolled oats. You don't buy it from the supermarkets. You get it from like these vegetable stores. So I have that with a couple of seeds and some protein powder. So some nice natural seed protein powder that I found that works for me. And then for lunch and dinner, I pretty much have the same meal or the same ratio of protein, carbohydrates, and vegetables. So I have 50% of my plate is like a dark green vegetable. So spinach or kale or broccoli, something dark green, because that's what I found to be the most nutrient dense with the micronutrients and the vitamins that we need. I'm vegan now, so I have a plant protein, and I get a nice plant protein, which is like some beans or lentils or something. And I stay away from the can, so I get it um, as the seeds, and soak them and cook them and boil them, etc. And then I have carbohydrates, which is usually sweet potato, butternut, pumpkin, or different rices. And I found sourdough bread works well for me. I know it's not perfect, but it works way better for me than the heavily processed bread. And then I have lots of fruits in between, so I snack on fruits, bananas and citrus and pineapples and whatever fruits I can get. And I drink lots of water. And that's pretty much my diet now that I've been on for maybe about 4 or 5 years. And I've never felt this good in my gut. I'm very regular with the bathroom. My stools are generally good. I've got no constipation. I like never have diarrhea. It's the best I've ever been. And it's taken me almost 35 years to find that particular diet that worked for me. So, Jayshal, the next section I wanted to talk about, and you touched on it a bit, before we started recording, was the relationship that people have with food, and how it's so inverted and perverse at the moment. And you sort of touched on it a bit earlier, right? You go to the store and you buy something off the shelf and package, and you've got no connection whatsoever to what happened from when that food was in the ground to how it got into that box or that packaging that you buy. And what do you mean about this relationship? What do you want people to learn from having a better relationship with food? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, no, this is something that I think is so vitally important when it comes to food, because we no longer see or recognize the conscious element of food. We go to the store, we buy our food, we bring it back home, we heat it in the oven, we consume it. There's no recognition of where this food is coming from. How did it get to the store? There's a total disconnect between what we're consuming. I mentioned earlier what the oils, how foods are cooked in oils. But let's take another example. Let's take the example of meat products. So I know both of us are on the vegan or vegetarian, but no judgment here. Let's just consider meat as how it goes through its processing cycle and then ends up in the store. When we consume meat, most of us go to the store, we'll end up picking up a package of meat, go to the store and you pay for it. You have no conception of how it got there. There's a total disconnect now between how that food actually arrived in that package. And because of that, we're not really conscious of how that got there. So if we think about the meat back in the past, before your ancestors would have gone out, they would have hunted the animal, they would have killed the animal. Oftentimes they would say a prayer of forgiveness, ask for forgiveness when they kill the animal. So there was a very conscious element to the killing process of the animal and then ultimately going through whatever processes needed to go through to get it all cleaned up and ready for consumption. But there was that conscious connection to the food. There wasn't that barrier in place. It didn't go through all these different processes or through the manufacturing process to get it to the store. So people were very much connected to the foods that they were eating. And even the animals, in terms of the psychology of the animals, it wasn't so mechanized in a sense that the animals don't go through some conveyor belt and they leading up to their death, because you can just imagine if we humans were to be put on a conveyor belt and you're going to be slaughtered, your stress levels would be so intense at that stage because your death is impending. Versus out in nature, if you have like a hunter gatherer who shoots an arrow in an animal, the animal isn't really expecting, in most cases it wouldn't really be expecting, it wouldn't be so extreme where the stress levels are so heightened versus what animals are going through now. So all of that energy, that emotional energy, ends up within the body of the animal, ends up within the very food. Because if we look at and I know a lot of what you have on your show is considering the energetic aspect of food, considering like how consciousness interacts with it. And I think that's really important as well when it comes to diet and understanding food, because there is that conscious element to food. And just because the food ends up in a package in a store, we are now disconnected from that conscious element. We're not really understanding how that food got there. So in these animals, there's a different process that it goes through. There's different energetic layers to it. So a lot of the meat that people are consuming today is having a very detrimental effect on people's health, primarily because of this disconnect, primarily because they are so disconnected from how these animals are being treated before it arrives on the table, or before it arrives at the store for purchase and then ultimate consumption. So because of that disconnect, it's causing a lot of havoc on people's digestive systems, more from an energetic perspective, and also because if you think about the cortisol and all the stress that is embedded within that meat product that's being consumed. So that is something that we need to start now becoming more conscious of. And that's not even considering all the antibiotics and all the hormones that these animals are being stuffed with. Sometimes you look at on Facebook and YouTube and you see the videos of how certain like chickens are basically being pumped up with chemicals or pumped up with things to make them, to fatten them up and to increase the sales of these products. And I think it's that piercing through that process to try and understand, lifting that veil almost, to understand what process did that food go through to get to the store. And that is why when you look at ancient traditions, some cultures consumed a heavy meat-based diet, but they didn't have all these health conditions. Now we have the situation where people are consuming meat, and meat is often being labeled as saying it's causing a lot of diseases and it's causing a lot of conditions because of the processing that it's going through. So without laying the ethical judgments on this whole thing, and without looking at it and saying, hey, you're doing wrong by consuming meat, but devoid of all of those judgments, if we just look at the differentiation between how our ancestors were consuming these foods versus how people today in modern society are consuming foods. And the same thing applies to plants and vegetables, right? Because we are so disconnected from the food itself and the processing that it goes through, we pick up a packaged product, it's been gone through who knows what processes to get there. It's just no longer the same. The other aspect that we need to understand as well when it comes to a lot of the packaged products and the processed, even plant-based foods, is what ingredients do we go to the store and start scrutinizing the ingredients to understand what was added to that food in order to make it taste that way? What is actually comprised within it? Because there's a lot of misinformation. When we look at a label and we think, oh, it's healthy, it's plant-based, it's got to be good for me. And we end up with that scenario where we see the way in which foods are being labeled is almost deceptive in a way that it communicates to us what it inherently is. Because sometimes you have a food product that may have just a minute portion of that food, yet it's labeled, oh, this is cauliflower pizza. Let's take cauliflower pizza, for example. A lot of now it's like, oh, cauliflower pizza is so healthy because the base is not so much of gluten, it's made out of cauliflower, so it's supposed to be good for you. But how much of cauliflower is really going into that food? How much of the beneficial ingredients are going into the food? So oftentimes when you look at the label, you'll see a whole bunch of modified processed flours, and you'll have the canola oil, which is back to the hydrogenated oils. You look at the yeast and all these other ingredients that are added to make that product what it is. Then you'll even have preservatives that are added to it. So when we're consuming that product, it's not really cauliflower pizza. It's basically an ultra processed version of cauliflower pizza. And then we think, oh, we're consuming something healthy because it's labeled healthy. Even a lot of these the foods that are considered healthy. So let's take, like, for example, a superfood, that's superfood protein powder. Superfood protein powder, they'll say, no, we're adding spirulina in it, we're adding all these moringa powder, all these beneficial ingredients in it. But do we really know how much of those ingredients are comprised within the foods? Now, those powders, when you purchase them yourselves, it's usually much more expensive. There is no ways that they are putting a good enough portion of those within those products. But if I just take a minute portion and I add it to that protein powder, I can now label my product and say, well, it contains spirulina, it contains moringa powder, it contains some other herb that is known to be highly beneficial. But we're deceiving the public. We're deceiving them in terms of the real composition of the food. How much is really in there? Is it really that? Is it comprised of something that is supposed to be beneficial, or are you loading it up with a whole bunch of fillers? It's the same thing with almond milk. If we take almond milk, for example, because a lot of us are waking up to the reality of the detrimental effects that dairy has on us. So when we look at almond milk, it's like 2% of the almond milk is almonds. 98% is all the gums and the fillers that are added to it to allow for it to be something that tastes good. But is it really almond milk? Is that not being deceptive to the public? Because you can't make almond milk. If you're going to purchase almonds yourself and make the almond milk yourself, it's going to cost you way more than what you're buying from the store packaged almond milk product. So there is no ways that it's economically feasible for them to sell a product which is 98% of almonds in it. So that's the realization that we have, and that's a disconnect that I think is so important, that we now sort of lift that veil to try and understand how are these foods really processed? What is really being added to these foods before we're consuming it? And that is why I think it's so important that we go back to eating whole foods, because at least sort of whole foods, we understand that it hasn't been through that much of processing. Obviously, we have to watch out nowadays for GMO foods and things that are non-organic. If people can grow food themselves, all the better. If we can start getting back into that culture of at least some aspect of subsistence farming, where we are able to grow our own foods, it will have a totally different effect on our health. Because even if we think about food from an energetic perspective, the time when the fruits are being plucked to the time when it arrives on our table, there's probably months have gone by. There's things that the foods are probably being stored in a certain way, picked when they underripe, ripen through the storage process or whatever, and then sometimes it gets treated with certain chemicals to preserve it for a little longer before it arrives at the grocery store. So the more and more we can get connected to our foods, eating foods as close to being ripened as possible to getting it from your garden, you're eating it at that same time, that energy is still intact within the food. And that can have a profound effect on our health as well. Unfortunately, I'm nowhere there to be having like a garden or anything where I can grow a lot of these foods, but I think it should be a goal that we should try and strive for that as a society in order to bring back that health and that vitality to society as a whole. And I think that is really important to try and now just shift our relationship with food. Like I'm so guilty, like you mentioned, it's not easy to give up a lot of these processed foods. They're very addictive. I still make those exceptions. But I think it's about understanding that when we pick up these processed foods, yes, it may be fine if we consume it occasionally, because it's like we're microdosing on chemicals and toxicity that's being found in our foods. Now, if you're microdosing with toxicity on a very occasional basis, maybe you make those exceptions every now and again to consume processed foods, then its effect may not be that detrimental on your health. But if we constantly eating these foods, and a lot of these foods, I don't blame anyone, because I was in that exact same scenario where you constantly gravitate to these foods because of the addictive tendencies towards consuming these foods. They trigger the bliss point. You know, if you ever read the book Salt, Sugar, Fat, it opens your eyes to how these foods are engineered to reach a certain bliss point, so it keeps us consuming more and more of these foods. But if we're constantly microdosing with all these chemicals, then what is happening to our health? We are putting more and more toxicity in our body. And it's also about having much more transparent practices when it comes to foods, because sometimes we have the situation where it's a lot of deceptive labeling. And I was delving down this rabbit hole to try and understand, what is it that they're really hiding through labeling things as natural flavors? Why can't you just list what you are putting there? Why do you need to say it's natural flavors? I have no clue what are natural flavors. And what I understood from diving down this rabbit hole is that it's actually MSG that is being hidden through this labeling called natural flavors. And MSG was the food that people were avoiding because we recognized a lot of the potato chips and all these processed foods were having MSG in it. So people didn't want to avoid it because we recognized that it was bad for us. So they took out that from some of the foods. But what happened is they started bringing it into these other processed foods and now concealing it through the labeling natural flavors. And natural MSG helps to it has that ability to increase the flavor of the food. It makes it taste that much more flavorful. So it's very addictive in its very nature. So a lot of them want to add MSG to the food so that it becomes more and more triggering to us to consume more of that food because it tastes so good. It allows for that flavor and that sense of wanting to consume more and more. So as a food producer or you manufacturing processed foods, you want to add these foods there because you want to make more sales. And it's recognizing the economic standpoint of it. You don't blame people because of the way in which this whole matrix society has been organized, is that it's all driven by profits. So whoever's making a processed food is not really concerned about your health. They're concerned about making more sales. And when we're concerned about making more sales, I don't care about the ingredients that I'm putting into the product. I want to make my product as cheap as possible so that I can maximize the amount of profits that I'm able to obtain from this food, from the product that I'm selling. And that is the awareness that we need to recognize, because if you a producer or you manufacturing a certain processed food, you're not going to use the most expensive oil. You're not going to use the most expensive ingredients. You're going to add as less as possible of the expensive ingredients, and you're going to look for alternatives that are cheaper. Try and label them in a way that is deceptive to create the impression that it's a very healthy food, and sell it, and sell volumes and volumes of it so you can maximize your profits. And that is this connection that we need to understand. We need to understand what is going into our foods. And unfortunately, because of the way in which society is structured, you don't blame the, the businesses that are being run this way because they want to maximize profit. It's not feasible. If they were to use the best ingredients and the best of nutrients and things in their foods, it wouldn't be feasible for them to sell it at those certain price points. It would be, to a large extent, it would be unaffordable to a large majority. And they wouldn't be able to operate their business in a sustainable fashion. And that is something we need to recognize as a society. It's a system that doesn't work. I don't think the solution is now going and pricing exorbitant products and saying, okay, now we've made it healthy, but we've priced majority of the market out of it. I think it's part of it is just getting back to nature, getting back, because that's the feasible solution, trying to at least get back to nature as much as possible, because nature is abundant. Nature is abundant with the foods that it can provide us in order to allow our health to flourish and allow for our own vitality. So it shouldn't be a case of food scarcity. We need to move away from that mindset because a lot of these forces are trying to create that belief that food is scarce and needs to be priced high, and inflation is going rampant now and becoming more and more unaffordable. And the more and more unaffordable, we need these strategic solutions to try and override that, to say, wait a minute, we can start growing our own food, relieve the burden, and the inflation will sort itself out. It's because of the manipulation of the currencies and things like that that is causing so much of detrimental effects on people's health. Because even if you just look at it, why is it that a Happy Meal from McDonald's costs less today than going and buying cauliflower from the grocery store? It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense because we are now forcing people to try and consume these cheap foods just to survive because they can't afford to have the whole foods. Whole foods these days are ridiculously expensive relative to these fast foods that we find.
Wow, Jayshal, that was so much deep information. I hope people listen to that because that was like probably the most authentic um, information that I've had about the relationship with food and how you need to look at food. And the society we are in today is completely disconnected. I mean, you were even reminding me of how disconnected I am. You know, I go to the vegetable shop to buy my vegetables, but I've got no idea where they come from, how long they've been plucked. I mean, what pesticides are used, what soil was it grown in, where was it grown? I've got no idea, right? And you're right, the food prices are going up. And the only real practical solution is to grow your own food or to live in a sort of community where people are growing their food and able to sustain um, a number of people with what's grown on your property or on shared property. And I know it sounds a bit far fetched, but I really believe that is like the next level of getting back to nature, getting back to earth, getting connected with what we eat. And what we eat is so important, right? I mean, you know, when I thought you were going to talk about the relation with food, I had no idea you were going to go on this deep level, right? I thought you were going to talk about like like the taste of food, you know, because for me, I think a lot of people buy food obviously for what they can afford, but they buy and eat food for what tastes good. And to me, the relationship with food should be, well, what nutrients and macro and micronutrients and vitamins am I getting from the food? Because the food is a fuel that runs this machine, which is my body, and I need to give it the right fuel to run. You know, and so when you were mentioning relationship, I thought you were going to go down that hole, but you went on a much more deeper, much more relevant, you know, much more authentic explanation of having that connection and awareness and understanding, you know, of the food that we consume. And this applies to meat, like you said, and to vegetarian food. Like, we're not judging meat and we're not judging anything. We're just about saying, have that awareness and connection with the food that you're eating. So I wanted to close off because we've covered a lot of really exciting information. I hope people can enjoy this. Watch this podcast in little bits, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, but we've packed as much relevant information we could into this sort of 19-minute show. But the last thing I wanted to leave everyone with is, when I started also eating whole foods and stuff, everything, like Jayshal was saying, there's gluten-free and there's plant-based this, and there's all these labels and these things that attract this new diet that I had adopted. And what I found was, a lot of these gluten-free breads and things and pastas that I bought, they still didn't make me feel good, right? So it was gluten-free pasta, but then I would get diarrhea. So I was like, okay, what's going on here? It's supposed to be gluten-free and healthy, but I still feel like sick after eating it. And luckily I was very aware, because I'd been doing this for a long time. So I'd become very aware of how my gut would react, and I would know what I ate, that would result in this. So I stopped buying these things that are labeled gluten-free because I didn't feel good after eating it. And these lactose-free things, and I don't know, all these labels, even the proteins. Like, I sort of didn't enjoy the proteins, and I stopped having sugar. I went to the honeys, and again, those didn't make me feel good. I would have the cravings. So eventually, I sort of found foods that aren't gluten-free. They're not labeled gluten-free. They just have less gluten. They're just whole foods that I found that when I consumed them, my body felt better. And if this is one thing that you take out of this podcast, this is what I would recommend you take, is learn to listen to your body, learn to listen to how your body responds to different foods, and then find what foods make you feel good. It's as simple as just seeing how you go to the bathroom a day or two after eating foods. Be aware of what you've eaten, and how's your stool, and how's your toilet movement, right? And it's as simple as that. We don't have to worry about all these complexities. I mean, Jayshal has given us all the details and the acid and the complexities of these different processes, but we don't have to do that. You just have to listen to your body. How do you feel after eating something? And then you'll find what foods resonate with your body. And then you can go deeper into more stuff. But I think that's a great starting point. Wouldn't you agree, Jayshal?
100%. You couldn't have summarized it better, because that's exactly what we need to be doing. We need to be tailoring an approach that works for us as individuals, because what might work for me or what might work for you, Deepak, may not work for somebody else. Everyone has a different energy system, and it, like, the constitution may be different. Even if you go down the Ayurvedic rabbit hole and you understand different constitutions, everyone's different. So we need to understand what's going to work for us as individuals. And sometimes it's a lot of trial and error. And it's about restoring that connection, that conscious connection to our body, to start to recognize. And I know it's not easy, but it's a journey. And it's, as long as we're taking those small steps, eventually we'll reach the top of the mountain. It's not a cable cart up the mountain, unfortunately. For some people, they're lucky if they get the cable cart, but for most of us, it's that long, tedious journey, and it's taking those small incremental steps that hopefully get us to health and vitality.
Oh, that's brilliant. Jayshal, I really appreciate your time and really appreciate you sharing your experience and journey and findings. And I'm sure there's so many people that can find a lot of useful insights, from the discussion we have. So, Jayshal, I hope we do chat again in the future around other topics. I can see that you have a lot of information to share with our viewers and audience. So, till then, thank you very much. Take care.